Kyle Abbott had spent enough time around complicated relationships to know when something was becoming dangerous. What he did not expect was for that feeling to return when he was simply trying to be there for Victoria Newman. Victoria had been carrying an enormous emotional burden. With Nick Newman struggling with addiction and the Newman family desperately trying to help him, her attention had been focused on keeping her family from falling apart. She was not looking for romance, and Kyle certainly was not supposed to become the person she leaned on. But that was exactly what was happening. At Crimson Lights, Kyle approached Victoria from behind, catching her by surprise. He immediately asked how she was doing and whether there had been any new developments with Nick. His concern seemed genuine, and Victoria appreciated that he was not treating her like someone who needed to be rescued. He simply wanted to know if she was okay. Kyle encouraged her to sit with him. What began as a casual conversation slowly became something much more personal. They talked about Nick, the pressures surrounding the Newman family, and how exhausting it could be watching someone you love struggle. Kyle understood more about family conflict than most people realized. His own history with the Abbotts had taught him that loyalty could sometimes become a burden. Victoria listened as Kyle talked about how time changes people. He mentioned Claire. That name immediately changed the mood. Kyle insisted that his feelings had changed and that he had learned how to move forward. He was no longer the same man who had been caught up in his relationship with Claire. But Victoria could tell there was still something complicated underneath his words. Then Claire and Holden walked into Crimson Lights. For one uncomfortable moment, everything stopped. Claire noticed Kyle sitting with Victoria. Kyle noticed Claire noticing them. Victoria immediately understood that this was not a simple coincidence. Claire, however, handled the moment better than anyone expected. Instead of confronting Kyle, she expressed appreciation for the way he and Jack Abbott had supported Victoria during Nick's crisis. Claire had no intention of turning the situation into another relationship battle. When Claire and Holden stepped outside, Holden could not resist asking the question that was already hanging in the air. Did Victoria want Claire to still be with Kyle? Claire shut the idea down. She understood that Victoria wanted her to make her own choices. Claire was not going to allow jealousy or insecurity to dictate her life. But Holden had other problems on his mind. He explained that Billy Abbott's battle for Chancellor Industries was becoming increasingly serious. Billy was demanding loyalty, and Holden was now caught between competing interests. Inside, Kyle and Victoria continued talking. Kyle tried to convince Victoria that seeing Claire with another man no longer affected him. Yet Victoria could see how complicated the situation remained. Then Billy appeared. He looked distracted, angry, and completely consumed by the Chancellor fight. Victoria immediately sensed trouble. Kyle also knew enough about the Abbott family to understand that Billy was heading toward a dangerous confrontation. But instead of getting involved, Kyle warned Victoria that sometimes the smartest move was to stay away from a war that could destroy everyone standing too close to it. That warning would become even more important as the day continued. Because Billy was already preparing his next move. Outside on the patio, Billy confronted Holden and made it clear that he wanted him to stay with Chancellor. But Billy also wanted Holden to understand something: neutrality was no longer an option. Holden would eventually have to choose. Billy promised that standing with him could lead to something much bigger. He hinted that Holden could someday run a company of his own. But Holden was not convinced. He wanted to know why he should trust Billy when the Abbott family itself was beginning to fracture over the Chancellor dispute. And while Holden struggled with that decision, another battle was taking shape inside Jabot. Cain Ashby was refusing to walk away. His motivation was Lily Winters. Cain believed Lily's interests were being threatened, and he was willing to fight Billy even if that meant making the entire situation ugly. When Billy confronted him, Cain refused to back down. Billy reminded Cain that Chancellor legitimately belonged to him. Then Billy offered Cain something unexpected, the same research and development position Cain had once offered him. It was supposed to be a peace offering. Cain saw it as an insult. He refused to accept a handout. The argument escalated until Jack Abbott became involved. Billy expected his father figure to defend him, but Jack refused to take the bait. That rejection hurt Billy more than he wanted to admit. Eventually, Billy stormed away. Jack then privately admitted to Kane that Ashley and Tracy had convinced him to stay out of the fight. Jack knew that Kane and Lily were going to do what they believed they had to do. But Jack had one warning. If John Abbott's name or reputation became collateral damage, Kane would have to answer to him. And that warning meant the Chancellor battle was no longer just about business. It was becoming a fight over family, loyalty, pride, and the legacy of the Abbott name. Meanwhile, Kyle and Victoria were still unaware that their quiet conversation had already created a new problem. Because Claire had seen them together. And now the question was no longer whether Kyle and Victoria were becoming close. The question was how long they could keep pretending that connection meant nothing. By the time Billy left Jabot, the damage had already been done. He had walked into the building believing that he could force everyone to recognize his claim to Chancellor Industries. Instead, he walked out realizing that even his own family was no longer willing to stand beside him without conditions. That was the part Billy hated most. He could handle Kane Ashby challenging him. He could handle Lily Winters building a legal case against him. He could even handle Victor Newman trying to destroy his credibility. But Jack Abbott refusing to defend him was different. Billy had spent years believing that the Abbott family would eventually rally around him when the stakes became high enough. Now Jack was telling him, in everything but words, that Billy had chosen this war himself. And Billy was not ready to surrender. He believed Chancellor was rightfully his, and he was convinced that the Abbotts had a legitimate claim to the company. The problem was that the harder Billy pushed, the more people began questioning whether his obsession was destroying the very legacy he claimed to protect. At the same time, Kane had no intention of stepping aside. His connection to Lily made the fight even more complicated. Kane was not simply looking at Chancellor as a business opportunity. He saw Lily's future being threatened, and he believed that standing back would be a betrayal. That was why he refused Billy's offer of a research and development position. Billy had tried to make it sound like a generous compromise. Kane saw it differently. He did not want a job from Billy. He wanted justice for Lily. And that difference was about to put both men on a collision course. Kane also knew that Lily was working with Amanda Sinclair and the legal team. The case against Billy might look weak from the outside, but Kane believed there was more happening behind the scenes than Billy understood. Billy was gambling everything on the idea that confidence would eventually become proof. Kane was gambling on the law. And Jack was gambling on staying out of the explosion. But Jack's warning about John Abbott changed the stakes. If Billy and Kane turned Chancellor into a public war that damaged John's reputation, Jack would no longer remain neutral. That meant everyone had something to lose. Meanwhile, Holden was facing his own impossible decision. Billy wanted him to stay. Lily's side needed him too. And Holden knew that choosing one side could permanently damage his relationship with the other. Billy tried to tempt him with the future. He suggested that if Holden stood with him, there could be opportunities far beyond Chancellor. Billy painted a picture of Holden eventually having enough power to run a company himself. But Holden was not convinced by promises. He wanted evidence. He wanted to know why Billy believed he was right. And most importantly, he wanted to know what would happen if Billy lost. Claire could see the uncertainty on Holden's face. She did not tell him what decision to make. Instead, she reminded him that whatever choice he made had to be his own. That conversation was important because Claire herself was learning how to make independent choices. Her relationship with Kyle had ended, but that did not mean she had stopped caring about him. Seeing Kyle with Victoria had been uncomfortable. Still, Claire was not going to turn that discomfort into anger. She had moved forward with Holden. And yet, Kyle's presence still carried emotional weight. The irony was that Kyle and Victoria were beginning to experience the same kind of emotional confusion from a completely different direction. Neither one had planned it. Neither one had openly declared anything. But they were becoming comfortable around each other. That comfort was dangerous because it was happening while both were vulnerable. Victoria was worried about Nick. Kyle was dealing with his own family crisis. They understood each other's pressure. And sometimes emotional connections become strongest when two people are simply trying to survive difficult circumstances together. That was exactly what made this situation so risky. Then there was Nick. His addiction remained the problem connecting almost every major Newman storyline. Victoria was trying to keep her family together. Nick was in rehab trying to confront his dependence on painkillers. And Victor and Nikki were preparing to take a more active role in helping their son. Victor Newman did not believe in sitting back and hoping problems solved themselves. He wanted a strategy. Nikki understood why. They had both seen addiction destroy lives, and neither wanted Nick to become another casualty. Their plan would require patience, control, and cooperation from Nick himself. But there was another problem. Nick's recovery was happening while Matt Clark was still moving through Genoa City. Matt wanted to apologize to Sharon. On the surface, an apology might sound harmless. But Sharon knew better. Matt's history with her was horrifying. He had stalked her, manipulated her, and caused unimaginable trauma for Sharon and her family. So even if Matt genuinely wanted to make peace, Sharon had every reason to fear being alone with him. And Nick's absence made that fear even stronger. If Sharon encountered Matt while Nick was still in rehab, she would have to confront that nightmare without the person who had often stood between her and danger. That was why Matt's apology could become something far more disturbing than he intended. At the same time, Jabot was preparing for another attack. Kyle knew that protecting the company would not be easy. Kane had already made his position clear. Billy was becoming more unpredictable. Jack was attempting damage control. And Victor was waiting for the right moment to challenge Billy's claims. The battle over Chancellor was spreading into every corner of Genoa City. But while the business war intensified, something much quieter was developing at Crimson Lights. Kyle and Victoria were still thinking about their conversation. Both knew there had been something different about it. Neither wanted to admit what it meant. And neither realized that their next encounter could push them beyond the point of pretending. Because once emotions become involved, business wars and family loyalties are no longer the only things at stake. Now hearts were becoming part of the battlefield. The Chancellor battle was becoming impossible to contain, but for Kyle Abbott and Victoria Newman, the real danger was much quieter. Neither of them had crossed a line. Not yet. That was what made their growing connection so complicated. Kyle kept telling himself that he was simply supporting Victoria during a difficult period. Nick's addiction had affected the entire Newman family, and Victoria needed people around her who could listen without turning every conversation into another argument. Kyle believed he could be that person. But Victoria was beginning to realize that Kyle's presence gave her something she had not expected. Peace. For someone surrounded by Newman family pressure, business rivalries, and constant emotional uncertainty, those quiet moments mattered. Still, Victoria knew exactly who Kyle was. He was Claire's former partner. He was an Abbott. And he was connected to a family that was becoming increasingly entangled in the Chancellor crisis. Victoria also understood what her father would think if he discovered how close she and Kyle were becoming. Victor Newman had never been known for accepting surprises gracefully. Especially when those surprises involved the Abbott family. That thought alone should have been enough to make Victoria step away. Instead, she found herself thinking about Kyle after he left. Kyle was doing the same. He could not stop replaying their conversation in his mind. He had talked about Claire as if his feelings were completely behind him. Maybe he believed that was true. But the moment Victoria asked about Claire, Kyle became more guarded. He knew Victoria had noticed. And that made him uncomfortable. Because if he was truly over Claire, why did the conversation still feel so complicated? Meanwhile, Claire was dealing with a different kind of uncertainty. Holden had told her about Billy's pressure and the situation at Chancellor. Claire understood that Holden was being pulled into a business war that could change his future. She wanted to support him, but she also knew that she could not make the decision for him. Their relationship was still developing. And Claire did not want it to become another situation where someone else's choices determined her life. She had already learned that lesson with Kyle. Now she wanted something different. Honesty, independence, and the freedom to choose her own future. But Holden's decision was becoming more urgent. Billy was not simply asking him to remain at Chancellor. He was trying to recruit him into a war. Billy wanted Holden to believe that standing with him would eventually lead to greater power. Yet there was one question Holden could not ignore. What if Billy was wrong? If Billy lost control of Chancellor, Holden could lose everything by choosing the wrong side. That uncertainty gave Kane an advantage. Kane did not need to make extravagant promises. He simply needed to remind Holden that loyalty had consequences. Lily's future was involved. Kane's reputation was involved. And the Abbott legacy was involved. The deeper Holden looked into the situation, the more complicated everything became. Then Billy made another mistake. Instead of slowing down, he became more aggressive. He began acting as though anyone who disagreed with him was an enemy. That attitude worried even the people who had once supported him. Jack could see where this was heading. And Jack knew that once Billy crossed a certain line, the family might not be able to repair the damage. That was why Jack remained determined to protect John Abbott's legacy. The Chancellor fight could be won or lost. Companies could be bought, sold, renamed, or rebuilt. But John Abbott's name was something Jack refused to see destroyed. Billy did not seem to understand that. He was focused on victory. Jack was focused on what victory would cost. Across town, Victor Newman was thinking about something even more personal. Nick. Victor had spent years believing that strength meant controlling every situation. But addiction was different. He could not simply intimidate it into disappearing. He could not buy his way around it. And he could not fight it for Nick. Nikki understood that better than anyone. They needed a plan that would help Nick without making him feel trapped. They also needed to prepare for the possibility that recovery would not happen overnight. Victor hated uncertainty. But for Nick's sake, he would have to accept it. Then Sharon's situation became even more alarming. Matt Clark wanted to apologize. Sharon did not want to hear it. To Matt, the apology might represent regret. To Sharon, his presence represented years of fear. That difference could create a dangerous misunderstanding. Matt could believe he was finally doing the right thing while Sharon could feel as though she were being cornered all over again. And if Matt approached her when no one else was around, Sharon's fear could quickly turn into panic. Nick's absence made the situation even more vulnerable. Sharon knew that Nick was trying to recover. She did not want to create another crisis for him. But she also could not ignore her own safety. Matt's history meant that an apology could never erase what had happened. The tension was building everywhere in Genoa City. At the Shadow Room, however, the atmosphere was completely different. Danny Romolotti was preparing to perform a song from his new album. Christine Blair Romolotti, Michael Baldwin, and Lauren Fenmore Baldwin were thrilled to see Danny embracing his future in Genoa City. But Danny had another announcement. He had worked things out with Noah Newman. Now Danny owned half of the Shadow Room. It was more than a business deal. It was Danny's way of proving that he intended to stay. After spending so much time away, he was finally choosing Genoa City again. But Danny's return could have consequences beyond the club. Because Noah's connection to the Newman family meant Danny was now closer to several of the city's biggest power players. And in Genoa City, nothing stays separate for long. A business deal can become a family issue. A friendship can become a romance. And a simple conversation can expose a secret. That was becoming especially true for Kyle and Victoria. The more they tried to treat their connection as harmless, the more obvious it became that something emotional was happening between them. Victoria knew it. Kyle knew it. And eventually, someone else was going to know it too. Claire had already seen them together. But she had not seen everything. Neither had Holden. Neither had Victor. And neither had Nick. The possibility of Kyle and Victoria becoming something more was no longer just a passing thought. It was becoming a real threat to the fragile balance between the Newmans and Abbotts. And if Victor discovered that his daughter was getting close to Kyle while Nick was struggling in rehab, he would not simply see a romance. He would see another Abbott-Newman conflict waiting to explode. That was why the next move mattered. Because once Victor Newman decided something threatened his family, he rarely waited for permission to strike. And Kyle was about to discover just how dangerous being close to Victoria could become. The danger surrounding Kyle Abbott and Victoria Newman was no longer something either of them could easily dismiss. What began as a conversation at Crimson Lights had slowly become an emotional connection neither had planned for. Victoria knew there were reasons to walk away. Kyle was Claire's former partner. He was an Abbott. And with Billy's battle over Chancellor growing more aggressive, the Abbott family was already becoming a major source of conflict for the Newmans. But none of that changed the way Victoria felt when she was around Kyle. For the first time in a long time, someone was listening to her without asking her to solve a problem. Kyle felt the same kind of relief. He had spent so much time dealing with family expectations, Claire's new relationship with Holden, and the Abbott business crisis that being around Victoria gave him a rare opportunity to forget everything else. That was exactly why the situation was dangerous. They were not falling toward each other because of some carefully planned romance. They were becoming close because they understood each other's pain. And that kind of connection can become impossible to control. Meanwhile, Claire was moving forward with Holden. She had already made it clear that she did not want her past with Kyle to control her future. But that did not mean she was blind. She had seen Kyle and Victoria together. She had noticed the way they talked. She had noticed the comfort between them. And even though she refused to create drama, the image stayed with her. Holden could sense it. He did not want to pressure Claire, but he also understood that Kyle was still part of the emotional history they were both trying to move beyond. Now Holden had another problem. Billy wanted his loyalty. Kane wanted him to understand the risks of siding with Billy. And Claire wanted Holden to make his own decision. Eventually, Holden would have to choose. Billy's promise of a powerful future sounded tempting, but the more Holden learned about the Chancellor fight, the more he wondered whether Billy was offering him an opportunity or simply another way to become trapped in the conflict. Kane was not willing to compromise. Lily was building her case. And Jack was watching the entire situation from a distance, hoping the Abbott family could avoid being destroyed by Billy's obsession. But Jack's patience had limits. If John Abbott's reputation was damaged, the fight would become personal. That warning could eventually force Jack to choose a side. And if Jack finally stepped in, Billy could discover that the person he expected to defend him might become one of his biggest obstacles. At the same time, Victor Newman was preparing his own strategy. Nick's recovery had become the family's priority. Victor and Nikki knew that Nick needed help, but they also understood that addiction was not something they could control with money or power. They had to give Nick a reason to keep fighting. Victoria wanted to support her brother. But while she was trying to help Nick, her own personal life was becoming more complicated. Kyle was becoming harder to ignore. And Victor would almost certainly see their relationship as a threat. Then there was Sharon. Matt Clark's attempt to apologize could reopen wounds Sharon had spent years trying to close. Matt might believe that saying sorry could help him move forward. Sharon might see it as another unwanted intrusion into her life. The difference between those two perspectives could make their encounter explosive. If Matt approached Sharon while she was alone, panic could take over. She had already endured too much from him to simply accept an apology. And with Nick away in rehab, Sharon might feel more vulnerable than usual. That could lead to another confrontation that forces Genoa City to remember exactly how dangerous Matt's history with Sharon really is. Yet while these personal battles were unfolding, the Shadow Room was offering something completely different. Danny's performance gave everyone a chance to celebrate. His new song marked a fresh chapter in his life. And his announcement that he now owned half of the club with Noah showed that Danny was serious about remaining in Genoa City. Christine, Michael, and Lauren welcomed the news. For Danny, the decision represented more than business. It meant coming home. But Genoa City has never been a place where anyone gets a peaceful fresh start for long. The Chancellor War was spreading. Nick's addiction was changing the Newman family. Matt's return was threatening Sharon's sense of security. And Kyle and Victoria were approaching a line that could completely reshape the relationship between two powerful families. The biggest question now was whether Kyle and Victoria would stop before things went too far. Victoria knew what Victor would do if he discovered the truth. Kyle knew how Claire might react if their connection became impossible to deny. And yet neither seemed ready to walk away. That was the shocking part. They were not making promises. They were not announcing a relationship. They were simply choosing to spend more time together. But sometimes the most dangerous romances begin exactly that way. A conversation becomes a habit. A habit becomes emotional dependence. And emotional dependence eventually becomes impossible to hide. As the week continues, the consequences could become much bigger. Billy may push harder to take control of Chancellor. Kane may escalate his fight to protect Lily. Holden may finally choose which side he believes in. Victor and Nikki may take drastic steps to protect Nick. Sharon may be forced to confront the man who traumatized her. And Kyle and Victoria could find themselves caught in a forbidden connection that neither family is prepared to accept. For now, everyone believes they still have time to control the situation. But in Genoa City, secrets rarely stay buried. The moment someone discovers what Kyle and Victoria are really feeling, the balance between the Newmans and Abbotts could collapse. And when that happens, this will no longer be a quiet attraction between two people. It will become another war. A war that could cost Kyle his family, Victoria her father's trust, and Claire the peace she has worked so hard to find. The Chancellor battle may have started as a fight over a company. But by the time everything comes to a head, it could become the spark that exposes every hidden feeling, every fragile alliance, and every secret relationship in Genoa City.